Joining us now, he's closing. Vince Haley, he is a candidate for State Senate District 12, and he's in a Republican primary. This is for the receipt of the retiring Walter Stosh, and the nominee is going to be decided in a primary on June 9th. There are 4 candidates: Vince Haley, Dr. Siobhan Tunavant, former House of Delegates member, Bill Janis, and Eddie Whitlock. And I've got this in a dead heat 3-way race right now between Tunavant, Haley, and Janis. And Vince Haley right there, and he is joining us now live. Vince, great to have you.
Thanks for having me on, John.
Go to Breitbart.com. You did an op-ed today that they were able to put out there. Can you share with our audience what it is, what you had to say?
Sure. Yeah, I wrote a piece for Breitbart that described my experience running for Senate here, and particularly what I'm experiencing at the door. You know, the central message of my campaign is that I think that we in Virginia can be much more aggressive in pushing back on the federal government when it overreaches. And, of course, it's overreaching in so many aspects of our lives. And so when I start a conversation at the door and say to people, you know, this is the passion for my getting into the race, and before I offer a single example of overreach, people already get it. They don't need to. They can fill in the blank themselves. They know that in a new way, the federal government is overriding, over-involving, as one woman put it, in so many aspects of our lives. And so I shared that in the piece in Breitbart. And I also articulated that my conviction that state legislatures have to be newly assertive. I mean, we have been forgotten, if you will, state legislatures as primary defenders of liberty in sort of deference to federal authority. But now federal authority, not just the executive branch, not just the Congress, not just the Supreme Court, but also all these federal agencies are overstepping their bounds. And unless the states punch back, you know, soon state legislative races will really be meaningless because all the decisions will be made from the federal government. And so I outlined the view that the state legislatures have to be far more assertive in pushing back. And I offer one example in particular with the EPA. You know, the EPA is doing many, many things that are costly upon the states, but the one that is the craziest is something that they're trying right now to coerce the states. They're trying to coerce the states into imposing on themselves these limitations on our emissions. And what it would mean for Virginia is that we would basically have to get rid of all our low-cost power. And Dominion estimates this would cause electricity rates in our state to go up 30%. This is a concrete example of where the federal government is wildly out of bounds. It's not me who says this, but President Obama's own Harvard law professor, someone who'd given to his campaign twice, Larry Tribe, he says we don't need to be burning the Constitution when we make our national energy policy. So we have to just say no to that. We don't have to cooperate, and I would lead the fight in the Virginia Senate to make sure that Virginians are defended against this kind of zealotry coming out of federal agencies. We have to say no to that. And, you know, John, on the show, I've talked in the past about, you know, my plan to lower income tax rates through a vision of phasing out Virginia income taxes over time by controlled spending. Well, you know what? We can do all that, and we could be successful in that, but that would be completely wiped out if federal agencies could simply increase the cost of doing business in this state by 30% on the energy side. So we have to really stop and push back on the federal government as hard as we can.
So how do you do that? I mean, realistically, it sounds good in an interview and a campaign speech, but let's say you're elected state senator of Virginia, and these APA regs are coming down, and we've got, as you mentioned, in Virginia, they're devastating from ozone to coal on down. So how do you stop that as a state senator? What do you do differently that's not being done now? And can you be specific as you can?
I'll be as specific as I can. Of course, the federal government is overreaching on a whole array of fronts. Some of them we're not going to be as decisive in stopping them. In others, we can be creative and I think really affect a stop. So, for example, in this EPA Clean Power Plan, what they're depending upon is the states to self-impose. Okay, they are trying to coerce the states to come up with their own plan. It's a two-part aspect or plan. They want states to come up with a plan, but the threat is if the states don't comply with or come up with a plan, that the federal government will impose one. Well, you should know, and your listeners should know, that at least right now there are several states, I think 15 states, that are suing, saying this is unconstitutional. Now, of course, our own Attorney General has not joined those lawsuits because he is on the side of the Clean Power Plan, along with Governor McAuliffe. But what we could do in Virginia is to say we're not going to cooperate. We're not going to fund any cooperation by any public servant of the Commonwealth. We're not going to spend any money cooperating with that plan. And we're going to speak out very forcefully that it's unconstitutional. So sometimes you have these legal lawsuits, and then all of a sudden the debate becomes a legal debate, and you've got lawyers talking to each other. That's fine. But on a political basis, the legislature needs to say that this is unfounded, it's unconstitutional, it's going to be destructive of the Virginia economy. We can punch back. We do not have to cooperate. If we get a couple of states, along with Virginia, that say, we're not doing this, okay, and we dare the federal government to come in, really, to come into Virginia and to take over our energy infrastructure, I dare you. It's not going to happen, and we will force the federal government to expose itself as a tyrannical power if, in fact, they even try to do something like that.
Well, so you would take the position that you would just say we're not going to do that. And obviously, if you could get a majority to say we're not going to do that, and it probably wouldn't be that difficult to do because anybody that's up for re-election in Virginia in any of these areas knows that a lot of this stuff is devastating the economy. If you just got a majority and said, look, we're just not going to comply, what happens?
Yeah, well, people say, well, you can't do that. Well, in 2009, they tried to pass cap and trade in the Congress. It passed in the House, but it never went anywhere in the Senate. It failed. They don't have the legitimacy to impose this. You can't go then to a federal agency and through an obscure provision try to claim this tremendous authority. We have to call out that it's illegitimate, it's unconstitutional, and it's a blatant overreach of the federal government. We will not comply with it. The states are not, pansies. We can take steps to push back. And in this case, we do not cooperate. The states should never cooperate with illegal and unconstitutional provisions or actions by the federal government. And this is one concrete one. Look, in a lot of cases, it may be unclear, okay? And there's maybe a good faith debate, perhaps. But in this one, it's really clear. They do not have the power. And look what we're talking about, John. We're talking about a 30% increase in electricity rates. And that may be a conservative estimate. Think about everybody's livelihood on this who's listening to this show about their own rates going up 30%. You know any seniors on fixed incomes? And on fixed incomes, that means they don't get a new source of revenue, a new source of income to match this increase in electricity rates. Mm-hmm. It's cruel to seniors, but it's cruel to every Virginian. And think of the businesses who are going to have 30% increase in electricity rates. And think of that rippling through the economy. This is a really big deal. And, I don't know if this is accurate, but if I were elected and if I did one thing to protect and defend Virginians and their economic livelihoods, the businesses, the individuals, stopping this plan, that actually may be the most significant thing I could do in 4 years. I'd like to think I could do a lot more, but, a 30% increase and perhaps more on the economy of Virginia and leveling down the Virginia economy to the other high-cost economies. Because one of the things that this plan is doing is saying, Virginia has a relatively low-cost energy advantage compared to other states like California, which has already caused itself to have very high costs of energy, and a lot of the northeastern states have very high costs of energy. It's basically saying, Virginia, you can't have an advantage on cost of energy. We're not going to allow it. We're going to level you with the other states. This is the ideological zealotry that's coming right now from the federal government, which we have to say, absolutely no cooperation with that.
Absolutely. I tell you what, I'm very encouraged by what you're saying. You're the first candidate in any of these races that I've been covering for the State House that has said that. And look, you got to draw a line in the sand somewhere, and you can't always be hoping the other guy does it or some other agency does it or somebody in Congress does it. Sometimes you got to take the bull by the horns and make a stand, right?
Well, that's right. And look, we have an ineffective Congress in stopping it. And, it's not as if this is a surprise to the people, to the voters. They know this. They know this in their bones, whether they know it about the Clean Power Plan, this EPA plan, or not. They know that the federal government, if you will, to use a Fonzie reference, has really jumped the shark, okay? It has really gone beyond what has happened in the past. So when you're running for state legislature these days, we really have a new case. We have a new situation. Yes, we need to lower taxes, and I've been very specific on a plan so that Virginia can be much more competitive with the other states and our attractiveness from a tax basis, which is what we need. Virginia's always been a pro-business state, and we need to find ways to change the direction on taxes and spending. I've talked about that a lot because that's a key building block for a successful Virginia future to have a way to lower our income tax rates. But the case is also new here with all this federal overreach. It is costly. It is imposing real burdens, and there's no accountability. Now, I will say, in the last session of the legislature, there was a provision, a bill passed, a law passed, signed by the governor, that said with respect to wood heaters, the EPA tried to regulate wood heaters in such a way as to almost make it impossible to have them.
Unbelievable.
Well, Virginia took a small step and said, we're not following those regs.
Right.
That's the principle. That's the principle. It's not radical, but that's the principle. States have to be key defenders of liberty. And the challenge we have today is we have a new case, if you will. The case is new. That is, the federal government is really overstepping its bounds in a new way, and the Congress is being ineffective in checking it. And if we don't stand up to the federal government's overreach and check it now, it's just going to get worse. And again, this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but in a few years, is it really going to be meaningful to be running for state legislature when all the economic decision-making is going to be taking place in Washington? We have a real threat, for example, that our social policies are going to be written by the Supreme Court. If they overturn the marriage laws in 2 months, the federal government is going to be far more involved in our social policy, not less involved, because there's going to be all these decisions by the Supreme Court, because now they're going to be making the judgments on all these things. And it's going to be less about what the people think and more about what unelected judges think. And the same applies to our economic decision-making. If it's made by federal bureaucrats in the bowels of the EPA, then what does it mean to have a state government anymore? And that's where we got to really stand up and change the way we think about this. And that's a key idea of my campaign. We have to stop this federal overreach with newly assertive state legislature in Virginia.
Now, Vince Haley, I want to get back to one of the issues that you've brought up, you've come under fire with, which is basically phasing out the income tax. It's a big idea, but you've been attacked on this by your opponents, basically saying, look, it sounds good, sound bite, might make sense, might play to the Tea Party, but at the end of the day, it's dumb, it can't work. What say you?
Look, there are 9 states in the country today that don't have state income taxes. They do much better than the other states. They grow faster. Their citizens have greater take-home pay. They have larger economies. They have more opportunities for their citizens. You had 11 states adopt the state income tax since 1960, and on all types of measures, they're at the bottom of the pack. So we know from experience, there's a considerable body of evidence. We know from experience that state income taxes are a very poor, inefficient way to collect revenues to finance necessary government. So then the question for us becomes, if that's better, how do we transition? Mm-hmm. And what I'm proposing, my idea, is that we have a responsible transition and we lower and phase out over time our state income taxes. Now, how do I say that we do that? I'm not asking to slash income taxes from one day to the next. What I'm saying is we have to control spending. If we can have this positive vision of a bigger economy in a no state income tax world, then what we should do is we should have a great incentive to control our spending, because basically Virginia spends whatever comes in. But if we control it on we don't have to cut anything. We just have to say that the level of growth stays very steady at, let's say, population plus inflation, which is typically around 2 or 3%. If we stay steady at that rate, we're going to generate revenues. In fact, there's been reports in the middle of April that we're on track to have a surplus come in. Mm-hmm. And what I'm saying is right now, under current Virginia law, we don't have a mechanism to take those surpluses and return it to the people in the form of lower income tax rates. What I propose is that we change the mindset and that we say when we generate surpluses, ongoing surpluses, we return it to the taxpayer in the form of lower income tax rates. Taxpayers will have more money in their pockets, but better, we're going to increase the size of the economy. There'll be greater incentives to come here and bring your business here and your hard workers here. People are moving from the high tax states to the low tax states. Now, unfortunately, in Virginia, we've dropped in attractiveness in the last 8 years because of our tax increases and our spending and our debt.
Right.
We've gone from 13th to 27th. We can change that situation. And the biggest thing I'd say to people who are critical or skeptical, look, North Carolina is doing it. Our neighbor to the south in 2013 made some choices, because prosperity is a choice. They made some choices. And what they decided was they were going to make their law such that when they got revenues of a certain size that has exceeded what they expected, they're automatically going to ratchet down corporate income tax rates. And they've gone from 6.5, and they're on track to be 3% next year in North Carolina. Well, that's a huge signal to the rest of the world that North Carolina is the place to do business. And they just announced last week a $400 million surplus. So I'd say to the skeptics, look, prosperity is a choice. You can make decisions that allow you to grow your economy. Look at Henrico County, where most of the voters in the 12th district are. Henrico County manages its money. They know it's the people's money. They have an ethos of only spending so much per year. And if they have a surplus, well, they return it to the homeowners in the form of lower real estate taxes. And they've dropped it 5 times.
Right. That's been a very successful plan, and certainly the North Carolina plan. And this is like the old Arthur Laffer curve back when Reagan was running for president in 1976, basically saying if you lower tax rates at a certain level, you're actually going to get more revenues because you're going to spur growth and jobs. We're out of time. Vince, I got 8 seconds. So what's your website?
Yeah, Vince Haley, Vince, V-I-N-C-E, Haley, Haley.com. If you go there, we have a nice event on Sunday at the Bird Theater.
Okay, VinceHaley.com.